The policy that was framed as economic pressure on China has redirected capital, technology, and supply chains toward China's long-term advantage. That is not interpretation. That is visible in trade data, investment flows, and industrial relocation patterns over the past several years. While tariffs were raised and restrictions announced, manufacturing networks did not return in the way policymakers expected. They reorganized. And in reorganizing, they often deepened China's role rather than reduced it. The uncomfortable detail is this: the attempt to isolate a system has, in several sectors, made that system more central to how the world now functions. If policies designed to weaken a rival end up strengthening it, what does that say about how power is actually shifting? I am Liang Wu. I follow supply chains, capital flows, and state decisions where they intersect. If you want analysis that begins with evidence rather than narratives, you should consider subscribing. Because what matters here is not the announcement of policy. It is what those policies produce once they meet the real world. By 2026, the United States and China are not simply in competition. They are restructuring the architecture of global trade. According to the World Bank and IMF datasets, global supply chains have not shortened in a uniform way. They have split. One network increasingly orbits U.S. regulatory space. Another continues to revolve around Chinese industrial capacity. At the same time, China remains the largest trading partner for more than 120 countries, a figure widely cited in international trade analysis. Tariffs imposed during the previous U.S. administration, maintained in large part afterward, did not dismantle this position. They changed the routes through which goods move. Consider what happened after the first round of tariffs in 2018 and 2019. U.S. imports from China declined in certain categories. That is the surface fact. But global trade data shows that imports from countries such as Vietnam, Mexico, and Malaysia increased sharply. That is not surprising. What matters is the second layer. Many of those countries rely on Chinese intermediate goods. Components, machinery, and inputs still originate in Chinese factories before final assembly occurs elsewhere. According to research from organizations like the Peterson Institute for International Economics, a significant share of this trade diversion reflects rerouting rather than replacement. The system adjusted. It did not withdraw, and that is where the strategic implication begins to emerge. The policy aimed to reduce dependence. Instead, it redistributed it. Dependence became less visible, but more embedded. It moved upstream into the supply chain where it is harder to measure and more difficult to replace quickly. When a system becomes less visible, it does not become weaker. It becomes harder to confront directly. There is another layer to this. Capital followed the same pattern. Restrictions on certain Chinese firms and technologies were intended to slow China's technological rise. In response, China accelerated domestic investment in areas such as semiconductors, artificial intelligence, and advanced manufacturing. According to publicly reported figures, China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars to semiconductor self-sufficiency programs through state-backed funds and industrial policy initiatives. Some of these efforts have faced setbacks. That is true. But the direction is clear. External pressure did not halt development. It concentrated it. At the same time, multinational corporations did not exit China at the scale that political rhetoric suggested. Many adopted what analysts now call a China plus one strategy. They diversified part of their production while maintaining a significant presence inside China due to infrastructure, workforce scale, and supplier ecosystems that are difficult to replicate. The result is not disengagement, it is duplication. And duplication is expensive. That cost is now embedded in global pricing structures. When costs rise, they do not disappear. They move. They move into consumer prices, into government subsidies, into corporate margins. They reshape economic behavior over time. This is why inflation dynamics in the early 2020s cannot be understood without looking at supply chain restructuring. The policy decision and the economic outcome are connected, even if they appear separate in public discourse. Now consider the balance of power over the next decade. If China retains its central role in upstream manufacturing while also expanding domestic technological capacity, its position becomes more resilient to external shocks. At the same time, if the United States and its allies create parallel supply chains that are more expensive to maintain, they accept a structural cost in exchange for strategic security. That is a deliberate trade-off. But it is a trade-off that reshapes competitiveness. There is also a geopolitical dimension that rarely receives careful attention. Countries in Southeast Asia, Latin America, and parts of Africa have benefited from supply chain diversification. They receive investment, they expand manufacturing, but they are not replacing China. They are integrating with it in new ways. Their growth is linked to both systems simultaneously. This creates a world where alignment is not binary. It is layered. Countries can be economically tied to China while maintaining security relationships with the United States. That complexity is not an anomaly. It is becoming the norm. The contradiction is clear. A policy designed to force separation has produced a system of deeper entanglement, only now distributed across multiple nodes instead of concentrated in one. And once a system becomes distributed, it becomes more resilient. Disrupting it requires more coordination, more cost, and more time. Which brings us back to the original premise. Power is not measured only by direct control. It is measured by how indispensable you are to the functioning of others. And in attempting to reduce that indispensability, the system may have reinforced it in ways that are less visible but more durable. The second layer is not about factories or tariffs. It is about institutions, standards, and the quiet architecture that determines who sets the rules others must follow. The surface fact is simple. The United States has increasingly used export controls, sanctions, frameworks, and regulatory power to restrict Chinese access to advanced technologies. This includes measures on semiconductor equipment announced in October 2022 by the U.S. Department of Commerce, targeting high-end chip manufacturing capabilities. The intention is clear: slow China's technological ascent by limiting access to critical inputs. But when a system is denied access to an external standard, it does not simply stop. It begins to build its own. That is the second layer. China has responded by accelerating the development of domestic standards bodies, alternative financial messaging systems, and parallel technological ecosystems. The cross-border interbank payment system, often described as a complement or alternative to SWIFT, has expanded its participation base beyond China. According to official data, CIPS processed transactions worth trillions of yuan annually by the mid-2020s. It is still smaller than SWIFT, but scale is not the immediate objective. Redundancy is. This matters because standards are a form of power that operates below visibility. When a country controls the dominant standard, others adapt to it. They design their systems around it. They become dependent on it in ways that are not easily reversed. The United States has held this position in finance and technology for decades. The question is not whether China can replace these systems entirely. The question is whether it can create alternatives that are sufficient for a significant portion of the world. Now consider the perspective of an actor that Western coverage often reduces to a passive participant: Saudi Arabia. For decades, its energy exports have been priced overwhelmingly in US dollars, reinforcing the centrality of the dollar in global energy markets. But in recent years, Saudi officials have publicly signaled openness to accepting other currencies for oil transactions, including the Chinese yuan. This does not mean an immediate shift, but it introduces optionality, and optionality is the beginning of structural change. Why does this matter? Because if major energy exporters diversify the currencies they accept, even partially, the demand structure for the dollar changes over time. It does not collapse. It adjusts. And adjustments in currency systems are slow, cumulative, and difficult to reverse once they reach a certain threshold. China does not need to displace the dollar to gain leverage. It needs to create a system where the dollar is no longer the only viable channel. The deeper implication is that policies designed to isolate China from existing systems may accelerate the creation of parallel ones. These systems do not need to match the scale of the original to be effective. They need to be sufficient for a network of countries that are willing to operate within them. And that network is not hypothetical. It includes parts of Southeast Asia, segments of Africa, and states in the Middle East that are balancing relationships rather than choosing sides. There is also a contradiction here that deserves attention. The same mechanisms used by the United States to exert pressure, such as financial sanctions and export controls, are effective precisely because of their centrality. But the more frequently they are used, the stronger the incentive becomes for others to reduce their exposure to them. This does not eliminate U.S. influence. It changes how that influence is exercised and how others respond to it. If this trajectory continues, the world does not split cleanly into two systems. It becomes layered. Countries operate across multiple standards simultaneously, selecting based on cost, risk, and political alignment. That creates a form of strategic ambiguity that complicates traditional alliances. And once ambiguity becomes embedded in the system, it becomes a permanent feature rather than a temporary condition. Which raises a question that is not often asked. If power is expressed through systems that others cannot avoid using, what happens when those systems become optional rather than mandatory? There is a deeper layer that sits beneath both supply chains and standards, and it is not immediately visible in trade data or policy announcements. It is time. The surface fact is that policy cycles in democratic systems operate on short horizons. Elections, legislative sessions, quarterly reporting. These structures shape how decisions are made and how quickly they must produce visible results. In contrast, China's industrial and strategic planning operates on longer timelines, often articulated through 5-year plans and longer-term development goals. This is not a value judgment. It is a structural difference. The implication is not that one system is inherently superior. It is that they operate under different constraints. When policies are designed to produce immediate outcomes, they may prioritize actions that show results within a political cycle. Tariffs, sanctions, public announcements, these are visible. They signal action, but their deeper effects unfold over longer periods, often beyond the horizon of the decision that initiated them. China's response to external pressure reflects this difference. Rather than reacting solely at the level of immediate policy, it often redirects resources into long-term capacity building. The semiconductor investments are one example. Infrastructure development through initiatives such as the Belt and Road is another. According to various estimates, China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars to overseas infrastructure projects over the past decade. Some projects have faced criticism and renegotiation. That is part of the process, but the scale and persistence remain. The deeper consequence is that when one system acts on a short cycle and the other responds on a long cycle, the effects do not align in time. The initiating action may appear effective in the short term. The response may appear slow. But over a longer horizon, the accumulated response can outweigh the initial action. This creates a form of strategic asymmetry that is difficult to perceive in real time. Consider how this plays out over different time frames. In 2 years, the visible effect of tariffs and restrictions may dominate the narrative. In 5 years, the reconfiguration of supply chains and standards becomes clearer. In 10 years, the cumulative effect of sustained investment in domestic capacity and alternative systems begins to define the balance of power. The question is not which moment is real. All of them are, but they operate on different timelines. This creates a dilemma for policymakers. To counter a long-term strategy, one must commit to a long-term response. That requires political continuity, sustained investment, and a tolerance for delayed outcomes. These are difficult conditions to maintain in systems designed for responsiveness and accountability over shorter cycles. The cost of alignment is political. The cost of misalignment is strategic. There is also a global dimension that complicates this further. Countries outside the primary competition are not passive observers. They are active participants shaping the outcome through their choices. When a country in Southeast Asia accepts infrastructure financing from China while maintaining security ties with the United States, it is not hedging in a temporary sense. It is constructing a position within a multipolar system that is still forming. These decisions accumulate. They create patterns that are difficult to reverse once established. The deepest consequence is that the competition is not only about who produces more or who controls more. It is about whose system others find easier to integrate with over time. Ease of integration is not determined by a single policy. It is determined by consistency, predictability, and the ability to deliver outcomes that align with the interests of others. If the current trajectory continues, the world in 10 years is not defined by a single dominant system. It is defined by overlapping systems with varying degrees of compatibility. That is a more complex environment. It is also a more stable one in certain respects, because no single disruption can collapse the entire structure. But stability in structure does not eliminate competition. It changes its form. And this is where the deepest tension emerges, because adapting to this environment requires accepting a level of complexity that political narratives often resist. There is one more layer that rarely enters public discussion, and it sits not in Beijing or Washington, but in corporate boardrooms and investment committees. The surface fact is that multinational corporations make decisions based on cost, risk, and return. These decisions are not ideological. They are calculated. According to data from UNCTAD, global foreign direct investment flows fluctuate with policy environments but consistently seek stability and scale. China continues to offer both in many sectors despite rising tensions. When policy signals conflict with operational realities, corporations adjust in ways that preserve their interests. They restructure supply chains, diversify risk, and engage with multiple regulatory environments simultaneously. This creates a form of private sector diplomacy that operates alongside state policy but is not fully controlled by it. The deeper implication is that corporate behavior can either reinforce or undermine state strategy. When companies maintain operations in China while expanding elsewhere, they sustain the very networks that policy aims to reduce. They do so because the cost of complete disengagement is often higher than the risk of continued engagement. This is not a temporary compromise. It is a structural feature of global capitalism. The consequence is that state policy and market behavior are not always aligned. They interact, they influence each other, but they do not move as a single unit. This creates friction within the system, and friction generates outcomes that are not fully intended by any single actor. If corporations continue to operate across both systems, they become conduits through which technology, capital, and practices flow even under conditions of tension. This does not eliminate competition. It complicates it. It makes outcomes less predictable and more dependent on interactions that are not visible in official policy statements, which leaves one unresolved question. If the actors with the greatest operational capacity are not fully aligned with the strategic objectives of the states they belong to, who is actually determining the direction of the system? If this analysis is reaching you, understand that it continues only through deliberate choice. Subscribing and sharing are not gestures. They are the mechanism that allows work like this to persist and reach those who are still looking for the structure beneath events. So what does all of this actually tell us? The attempt to reduce dependence on China has not removed that dependence. It has redistributed it across supply chains that still originate in Chinese industrial capacity. Trade data after the 2018 tariff rounds showed diversion, not disappearance, with inputs continuing to flow through third countries. At the same time, export controls on advanced semiconductors did not halt China's trajectory. They accelerated domestic investment measured in hundreds of billions of dollars across state-backed programs. Pressure at the system level triggered adaptation at the structural level. This connects directly to the second layer. When access to dominant standards is restricted, alternatives begin to form. Systems like CIPS, still smaller than SWIFT, exist not to replace immediately but to reduce vulnerability over time. The more frequently central systems are used as instruments of pressure, the stronger the incentive becomes to build parallel ones. Add to this the behavior of actors such as Saudi Arabia, signaling openness to non-dollar energy transactions, and the picture becomes more complex. Not a collapse of existing systems, a gradual dilution of exclusivity. Then consider time. One system acts on electoral cycles, the other accumulates capacity over decades. The effects do not align in the same time frame. Short-term visibility favors the initiating policy. Long-term accumulation favors the responding system. This asymmetry shapes outcomes that are often misread when viewed through a single political cycle. Finally, the corporate layer complicates everything further. Multinational firms continue to operate across both systems because the cost of full disengagement remains higher than continued integration. Their decisions sustain the very networks policy seeks to fragment. The result is a structure where state intent and market behavior do not fully align. Taken together, this is not a story of one side advancing and the other retreating. It is a story of a system becoming more distributed, more layered, and more resistant to singular control. And before this analysis ends, there is one more thing that needs to be said clearly. The evidence points toward a period of managed competition rather than decisive separation. What should be watched closely is not rhetoric, but adjustment. First, whether U.S. semiconductor restrictions expand further or begin to stabilize, because escalation will accelerate parallel development. Second, whether major energy exporters move beyond signaling into actual multi-currency settlement practices, even in limited volumes, which would indicate structural change in financial flows. Third, how multinational corporations allocate capital over the next 2 years, particularly whether they deepen dual system operations or begin to consolidate around one framework. None of these developments alone determines the outcome. Together they reveal direction. There is uncertainty here. Policy can shift, external shocks can alter trajectories, but the underlying pattern suggests increasing complexity rather than resolution. The viewer should not expect a single decisive break. They should watch for incremental changes that accumulate into structural transformation. This analysis is provided for educational and informational purposes only. It does not constitute policy advice, intelligence assessment, or advocacy for any government or political position. The observations and conclusions presented here are based on publicly available sources and represent an independent analytical perspective. Some figures may require verification and are marked accordingly. The voice you are hearing in this video is generated using artificial intelligence. Viewers are encouraged to consult multiple credible sources, examine primary data where possible, and form their own conclusions based on a broad range of information. Staying genuinely informed about how power moves, not how it is presented, is one of the most consequential decisions a person can make. Most people will not do this work. That is the reality. Share this analysis with one person you know who should understand it. Not everyone, one person, because that is how serious information moves. Leave one comment with your reading of where this goes next, or the country you are watching most closely. Every comment, every share extends the reach of analysis that does not rely on slogans. The next development in this story will not be announced where most people are looking. I am Professor Liang Wu. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never mistake a quiet news day for the absence of history being made.